The wound was not supposed to be that deep. Molly had treated torn skin before. Hunters who stumbled back from the forest's edge. Children who'd scraped themselves on the old stone wall. Even a soldier once, years ago, who'd arrived at her door pale as chalk and breathing in shallow gasps. She knew wounds. She knew the difference between flesh that would knit cleanly and flesh that had been torn by something that did not want to let go. This was the second kind. She found him at the edge of the ashwood just before dawn, on the morning after the longest night of the year, when the moon had burned so full and fierce that Molly had barely slept, her small cottage rattling in the cold wind that swept down from the northern ridge. She had gone out only because her goat, Agnes, had broken free of the pen again, and had a talent for disappearing into the tree line before the light came up. She had not expected to find a man. He was lying against the roots of the great oak that marked the boundary between the village's cleared land and the deep forest that no one from Ashford Hollow entered without reason. He was on his side, one arm curled beneath him, the other stretched out across the frost-stiff grass. His clothing was dark, leather and wool, thick straps across his chest, a fur-lined cloak half pinned beneath him, and for one breathless moment, Molly thought he was dead. Then he moved. Just barely. A shift of the shoulder, a sound that was barely audible, low and rough, almost animal. But it was enough. Molly's feet moved before her mind caught up, and she was crouching beside him before she'd thought clearly about what she was doing. "Don't," she said, out of reflex, when he tried to push himself upright. "Don't move yet." Her hands found the source of the bleeding by instinct, the long, brutal gash that ran from just below his left shoulder blade down and across his ribs. It had soaked through the layers he wore, dark and alarming, but the bleeding had slowed. Her fingers pressed against the wound through the fabric, and the man made a sound low in his chest, but did not pull away from her touch. She looked at his face then. It was a face that did not belong in her village. She understood that immediately, the way she sometimes understood things without being able to explain them. A quiet certainty that settled into her chest like a stone dropping into still water. He was not a farmer. He was not a hunter from the valley settlement. The lines of his face were hard and deliberate, like something carved rather than born, and even half-conscious and bleeding against a tree root, there was a quality of authority about him that made the air around him feel different. His hair was dark, braided close on the sides and longer at the back, loose now from whatever had bound it. A scar crossed the edge of his jaw, older and silver pale against his skin. His eyes, when they opened and found her face, were a gray so dark they were nearly black. He said nothing. He simply looked at her. "Can you stand?" she asked. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. A pause. Then quietly, "Yes." He could not without her help, and even then it cost him something. She could see it in the set of his jaw, the controlled way he refused to make a sound. She got her shoulder under his arm, felt the sheer weight of him settle against her, and somehow they made it across the frost-hard ground to her cottage door. Her name was Molly Vane, and she was 24 years old, and she was the only daughter of a healer who had died 3 winters past. She had inherited the cottage, the knowledge, and the modest reputation that came with both. The village of Ashford Hollow tolerated her the way they tolerated most things that were useful, but slightly uncomfortable, with distant gratitude and not much curiosity. She kept to herself. She grew her herbs. She fixed what she could fix and did not ask questions about the rest. She had lived her entire life in the shadow of the wolf territories, and had learned very early that the wisest policy was to stay out of their way entirely. She had not, until that morning, fully appreciated how completely she had failed to follow her own advice. Inside, she got him onto the low cot near the hearth, the one she kept for patients who couldn't be moved home the same night, and cut away the outer layers of his clothing with her shears to get a proper look at the damage. The gash was long and jagged, the kind that came from claws, not blades. Deep enough to require stitching. Deep enough that it had no business having stopped bleeding as quickly as it had. She worked in silence. Fire, water, the cleaned linen she kept folded in the cedar chest, the thread she boiled in vinegar before every use, the poultice of yarrow and comfrey that her mother had sworn by. Her hands moved through the familiar steps without trembling, because she had learned long ago that trembling was a luxury, and the person on the cot could not afford to buy it for her. He watched her work, not impatiently, not with suspicion. He simply watched, the way someone watches a thing they are genuinely trying to understand. "You're not afraid," he said at some point, when she was halfway through the stitching. "I'm afraid," she corrected, without looking up. "I'm just busy." Something shifted in his expression. She didn't examine it. She didn't ask him his name. She didn't ask him what had torn him open in the ash wood in the middle of the night, or who else might be out there, or why a man with that kind of presence was lying against a tree root alone at the edge of a village that barely appeared on any territorial map. She asked only what she needed to know for the wound. Had he lost feeling anywhere in his arm? Was the pain sharp or dull? Had he taken anything in the hours before she found him? He answered each question precisely and without elaboration. By the time the light outside had shifted from gray to pale gold, the wound was closed and dressed, the fire was rebuilt, and Molly was sitting in the chair across the room with her hands wrapped around a cup of warmed water, steeped with rosemary and dried chamomile, because her stores of proper tea had run out 2 weeks ago, and she hadn't yet made the walk to the market. He had closed his eyes. His breathing had steadied into something even and deep. She should have felt relieved. She had treated him. He was alive. That was the entire scope of what she'd been trying to accomplish since she found him in the frost at dawn, and she had accomplished it. She should have been sitting quietly, grateful for an uncomplicated outcome. Instead, she kept looking at the marks on his forearms. She hadn't noticed them during the stitching. She'd been focused on the wound. But now, in the cleaner light, she could see them clearly. Symbols pressed into the skin at his wrists, old and precise. The kind of work that required intention. She had seen similar markings once before, in one of the bound volumes her mother had kept locked in the chest beneath the floorboards. The chest Molly had only opened twice, and both times with the distinct feeling that she was looking at things she wasn't meant to see. The markings in the book had been labeled in her mother's careful handwriting. 2 words only: Alpha King. The cup was warm in Molly's hands. The fire crackled softly. Outside, Agnes the goat had apparently found her way back to the pen on her own, because Molly could hear the faint, indignant sound of her bleating at the latch. Everything in the cottage was exactly as it always was, except for the man on her cot, except for the silence of the forest outside, which Molly had grown up reading the way other people read weather, and which was telling her, with quiet and absolute certainty, that the ashwood was not empty. Something was out there, waiting. She just didn't know yet whether it was waiting for him or for her. She did not sleep. She told herself it was because someone needed to watch the wound. Infections could turn fast, especially claw wounds, especially ones that deep. But the truth was simpler and less professional than that. The silence outside her cottage had changed. It was not the silence of an empty forest. It was the silence of a held breath, of many things standing very still. And Molly had grown up in Ashford Hollow long enough to know the difference between absence and presence, wearing absence as a disguise. She kept the fire low, and her position in the chair by the window, where she could see both the cot and the tree line without turning her head. He slept through the morning and into the afternoon. Not the restless, fever-broken sleep of someone whose body was losing the fight, but the deep, controlled unconsciousness of someone who had simply decided that rest was necessary and had arranged themselves accordingly. Even in sleep, there was nothing helpless about him. His breathing was measured. His face did not change. He lay exactly as she had positioned him, on his uninjured side, one hand loosely open near his face. Molly changed the dressing once, working carefully, watching for the red streaking that would mean trouble. There was none. The wound was angrier than she liked, the edges still swollen, the surrounding skin hot to the touch. But the stitches were holding, and the yarrow poultice was doing its work. She had seen wounds like this take a week to close on an ordinary man. She suspected he was not an ordinary man. Around midday, she heard the first howl. It was far away. North, past the ridge. And it might have been dismissed as a common wolf to anyone who hadn't spent their life learning the difference. But common wolves didn't produce that sound. That sound had shape to it, structure, intention. It was a question asked in a language she couldn't speak but could feel in the base of her sternum like a struck bell. The man on the cot opened his eyes. He did not startle. He did not reach for a weapon, though she suspected he had at least one somewhere in the folds of the cloak she had draped over the cot's edge. He simply opened his eyes and looked at the ceiling, and she could see him listening. "They're looking for you," Molly said. She kept her voice level. "Yes." He turned his head toward her. The gray of his eyes in the afternoon light was remarkable. Not the flat gray of overcast sky, but something with depth to it, like river stone seen through clear water. "How long was I unconscious?" "Most of the morning. It's past midday now." A pause. He absorbed this with the same quiet economy with which he seemed to absorb everything. "The wound. Closed and dressed. You'll need to keep it still for several days if you want it to hold. The tissue was badly torn." She folded her hands in her lap. "Claw wounds tend to carry contamination from the source. I cleaned it thoroughly, but you should watch for fever tonight." He looked at her for a moment. Something in his expression shifted. Not softening exactly, but adjusting, the way a door opens by a precise and deliberate amount. "You didn't run," he said. "I considered it," she admitted. "But you were bleeding on my property, which creates a certain obligation." Another howl, this one closer. Then two more, overlapping, from different directions. Molly kept her eyes on his face, rather than turning toward the window, because she already knew what she would see if she looked. Nothing yet. Just the tree line. But the tree line was no longer empty. "What is your name?" he asked. "Molly Vane." She paused. "I know who you are." The room was very quiet. Outside, a wind moved through the pines and carried with it the green cold smell of resin and something darker beneath it. The particular wild scent that she now associated entirely with him, and which the forest outside seemed to carry too, amplified and multiplying. "How?" he asked, not alarmed, simply asking. "My mother kept records, old ones." She chose her words carefully. "I recognize the markings on your wrists." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Most people in a village this size would not have opened that door for me. Most people in a village this size would not have found you before the frost finished what the claws started," she replied. "I was looking for my goat." Something crossed his face then that might, in another set of features, have been the beginning of a smile. It did not quite arrive. His name was Draven. She had already known that too, in the way she sometimes knew things, not from the records, but from the quality of the silence that surrounded him, the specific texture of the howls outside. She had heard the name spoken once, 2 years ago, by a trader passing through who had dropped it like something too heavy to carry carelessly. The Alpha King, Draven of the Northern Packs. The man who held the 11 wolf territories under a single seat of power for the first time in 3 generations. The man the other alphas feared openly, and the common packs followed without being asked. He was on her cot, wearing her stitches, and outside her cottage, his wolves were drawing a circle that she was increasingly certain she could not step outside of. "Why were you in the Ashwood alone?" she asked. He did not answer immediately. She had the sense he was deciding not what to say, but how much. "I was not meant to be alone," he said finally. "There was an ambush. My guard was separated from me." "Ambush." She kept her voice steady. "By whom?" "That," he said quietly, is what I need to determine. She stood then and went to the window. Not the front window, the narrow side one that looked toward the eastern tree line, half obscured by the old hawthorn that grew against the cottage wall. She looked out carefully, keeping herself to the edge of the glass. She counted 7 shapes at the tree line, large ones, not quite still, shifting weight, watching the cottage with an attention that was entirely unlike how animals watched. Even from this distance, she could feel the directedness of it. 7 that she could see. How many? He asked from the cot. He had heard her breath change. 7 on the eastern side. She moved to the front window. I can't see the western. There will be more on the western side, he said, not worrying, stating. Molly let the curtain fall back into place and stood in the middle of her cottage with her hands at her sides and thought, with great precision, about what exactly she had walked into when she went out in the dark to find her goat this morning. Are they yours? She asked. Some of them. A pause that was heavier than the ones before it. Not all. She turned to look at him. He was watching her with that same quality of attention he'd had since he opened his eyes. Complete, unhurried, like someone who had learned that looking carefully was more useful than speaking quickly. The ones that aren't yours, she said slowly. Are they here for you? Or for me? The pause before his answer was exactly 1 breath too long. We need to know, he said, whether your name means anything to anyone with reason to want me dead. The fire popped softly in the hearth. Agnes had gone quiet outside. The wind had died, and in the stillness that replaced it, Molly became aware, with the particular clarity that comes from the body understanding something before the mind catches up, that the shapes at the tree line were not moving away. They were moving closer. She crossed to the cedar chest beneath the window without hurrying and lifted the lid. Beneath the clean linens, beneath the sealed jars of dried herbs and the folded linen bandages, and the small locked box that held her surgical tools, her hand found the false bottom her mother had built into the chest 20 years ago, and beneath the false bottom, she found what her mother had left her. Not a weapon. She had no weapons. A map. Old and dense with notation, the ink faded to amber in places but still legible. A map of the 11 wolf territories, with Ashford Hollow marked in her mother's handwriting. Not on the border as she had always been told, but directly at the center of an old boundary line that hadn't appeared on any common map in 30 years. And her mother's name, written in the corner in someone else's hand. A name she recognized from the same locked records, the same sealed pages. Her mother had not simply been a healer who kept old books. Molly stood with the map in her hands and felt the ground shift beneath her in a way that had nothing to do with the earth. Behind her, Draven said very quietly, what did you find? She turned around. She held up the map. His expression did not change, but something behind his eyes did. A recognition, sharp and immediate and controlled before it could become anything else. Your mother, he said, was known to the council. Tell me, said Molly, exactly what that means. Outside, the howling began again, closer now. All around the cottage, from every direction, rising together, until it was less like sound and more like pressure, like the world itself, pressing in from all sides. 200 wolves, she would later be told. But that knowledge came later. The map shook slightly in her hands. She made herself hold it still. Draven had pushed himself upright on the cot, carefully, his left arm braced against the wall rather than his injured side, and was watching her with the kind of focused stillness that she was beginning to understand was not passivity, but its opposite. He was thinking. He was calculating. He was doing it quietly, the way a millstone grinds, without announcement, without pause. Sit down, she said automatically, because the wound was her responsibility regardless of everything else. You'll tear the stitching. To her surprise, he listened. He lowered himself back by a degree, though he did not lie flat again. A compromise. She filed that away. My mother, she said, keeping her voice even, was Sarah Vane. She was a healer. She lived in this cottage for 30 years, and she died here 3 winters ago of a fever that came on fast and didn't let go. She set the map on the table, smoothing it flat with both palms. She never told me she had any connection to wolf territories beyond treating the occasional injury that stumbled out of the ashwood. She never told me she had any connection to any council. She never told me that Ashford Hollow sat on an old boundary line. She looked at him. So whatever you recognize when you look at that map, I need you to say it plainly. Draven looked at the map for a long moment. The firelight moved across his face, catching the angles of it, the old scar at his jaw. The boundary line your cottage sits on, he said, was drawn as part of the Vane Accord, 40 years ago, negotiated by your grandfather, Edmund Vane, who was the human liaison to the Interterritorial Council at the time the 11 packs signed the Consolidation Treaty. He paused. The accord guaranteed neutral passage through this region for any pack in conflict, access to healers at 3 designated points along the line, and protection of the families who maintained those points. Molly stared at him. I've never heard of the Vane Accord. No, he said quietly. You wouldn't have. It was sealed from common record when Edmund Vane died. Someone on the council moved to have it buried. Who? That, he said, is a question I have been trying to answer for 2 years. She pulled the chair away from the hearth and sat down across from him. Outside, the howling had not stopped, but it had changed register, no longer the urgent summoning call of before, but something lower and more sustained, a sound that surrounded the cottage like walls being built from the outside in. She was aware of it the way she was aware of her own heartbeat, constantly, and with a growing understanding that she could not ignore it. The ambush last night, she said. Was it connected to this? Everything connected to the council's buried records has been connected for 2 years. His voice was even, but she heard the weight behind it. Someone does not want the Vane Accord to resurface. It would reestablish rights and protections that were quietly stripped when the record was sealed. It would also identify the individual who ordered the sealing, because the original document bears a seal of authorization. And if that individual is on the council now, then they have been operating with the authority they stole, he said. And everything they have built on top of that theft becomes questionable. Molly looked at the map, at her mother's name in someone else's handwriting in the corner, at the boundary line running directly through the land her family had occupied for 40 years, marked in ink that was old but deliberate. My mother knew, she said. It wasn't a question. The certainty of it landed in her chest like a key turning in a lock she hadn't known was there. I believe she was protecting the knowledge until it was safe to bring forward, Draven said. The sealed record didn't eliminate the physical copies that were distributed to the 3 healer families along the line. It only eliminated the official acknowledgement of their existence. There are 2 other families. There were. A pause, brief and heavy. The Ashby family's copy was destroyed in a fire 8 years ago. The fire was recorded as accidental. He let that settle. The Croft family's copy disappeared when their house was raided 6 years ago. The raid was attributed to a rogue pack, never formally investigated. The fire in the hearth burned low. Molly stood and added 2 pieces of wood from the stack beside the wall, because her hands needed something to do, and because the room had grown cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. So mine is the last copy, she said. Yes. She turned to face him. And the people who've been eliminating the others, they know it exists. They have suspected, he said. Your mother was careful. She moved the document 3 times in the last decade of her life. She told no one, as far as I can determine. He met her eyes steadily. But your mother's death was faster than a natural fever typically progresses. The room was very quiet. Molly had known, in the wordless way that grief sometimes knows things before the mind will accept them, that her mother's death had not been right. The fever had come from nowhere. It had moved with purpose. The village healer from the next settlement had come and looked and shaken his head and said, "Sometimes these things happened, especially in winter, especially in women who had worked too hard for too many years and let themselves grow thin." She had accepted it because she was 21 and devastated and had no framework for questioning it. She had a framework now. "They killed her," she said. Her voice did not break. She would not let it. "I believe so," Draven said. "And I believe the ambush last night was not only aimed at me. I think I was followed here. I think someone already knew the approximate location of the last copy, and when they saw me moving toward this region, they decided to remove both problems at once." Molly pressed her fingers against the edge of the table and held on. A sharp crack of sound came from outside. Not a howl, but a branch breaking, close, on the western side of the cottage. Then another. Then the low, rhythmic sound of many feet moving through frost-hardened ground. Draven straightened fully now, wound or no wound, and she didn't argue with him this time. He reached beneath the folded cloak and produced exactly what she had suspected was there, a long knife in a worn leather sheath, which he set on the cot beside him with the quiet practicality of someone who has done this many times before. "The wolves outside," she said. "Your guard. How many?" "Enough," he said. "If the hostile ones outside are what I think they are, my people will have identified the difference by now. And if they haven't, then this conversation is a great deal shorter than either of us would prefer." A sound at the door, not knocking, but a specific pattern of contact, 3 short and 2 long, barely audible. Draven's posture changed immediately, not relaxing but reorganizing itself. He gave a single low sound in response, nothing that Molly could have described as a word, and after a pause the pattern repeated. "My second," he said. "She's telling me the perimeter is established." "She," Molly said. "Commander Voss," he said, and there was no inflection on it, just the name delivered as information. "She has led my guard for 6 years. She is the most capable person I have ever worked with, and she will not come through that door unless I tell her to." Molly looked at the door, then at him. "You could leave," she said. "Take the map. Take whatever information you came here for. I'll tell anyone who asks that I found an injured man and treated him, and he moved on." She heard herself saying it, and felt the flatness of it, the hollowness at the center. That keeps you clear of a cottage in a village that barely appears on any territorial map, and it keeps me. "It does not keep you," he said. His voice was not sharp, but it stopped her completely. "You are already inside this. The copy is here. Your name is on the accord by inheritance. The people who ordered the ambush last night will know by morning that someone in this cottage treated an injured man and that a perimeter was formed around it." He looked at her without any softening of the truth between them. "If I leave you here, you are not safer. You are simply alone." Molly looked at him for a long moment. She thought about her mother, who had moved this document 3 times in 10 years and told no one, not even her daughter. Who had spent 30 years in this cottage being carefully, quietly, deliberately invisible. Who had died of a fever that came on fast and didn't let go. She thought about the Ashby family and their fire, the Croft family and their raid. She thought about the map on her table with her grandfather's name in the corner and the boundary line running through her land, and 40 years of a thing her family had been trusted to protect, without ever being told they were protecting it. She thought about her mother's handwriting in the old locked books, careful and precise, the handwriting of someone who understood that words, recorded correctly, could outlast almost anything. "All right," Molly said. She picked up the map, folded it with the same care her mother had used, and tucked it into the inner pocket of her wool cloak, which hung on the hook beside the door. "Tell me what we do next." The plan, as Draven outlined it, was not complicated. That was either reassuring or alarming. Molly hadn't decided which. Commander Voss came through the door when called. A woman of perhaps 35, broad-shouldered and dark-skinned, her hair cut close to her head, wearing the kind of practical traveling clothes that had clearly seen serious use. She assessed the room in approximately 2 seconds. The cot, the wound dressing, the fire, Molly, the map-shaped outline in Molly's cloak pocket, and said nothing except a brief report delivered to Draven in a low voice that Molly was clearly meant to hear. 43 wolves on the perimeter, she said. Draven's guard had identified 19 of them as belonging to packs aligned with Lord Cassin of the Eastern Reach, a council member whose territory bordered 3 of the 11 packs, and who had, according to Voss, been quietly consolidating influence for the better part of a decade. Cassin. The name meant nothing to Molly yet. It would. The remaining 24 wolves on the perimeter were Draven's own, his guard, which had regrouped through the night and tracked him by the particular way his blood moved through cold air. Voss explained this without ceremony, as though it were entirely unremarkable. And they had formed a counter-perimeter inside Cassin's line, which meant that the cottage was currently at the center of 2 concentric rings of wolves, standing very still in the dark, watching each other with professional intensity. "Can we move through?" Draven asked. "If we move now, before Cassin's people receive further instruction," Voss said. "They're waiting for a signal. When it doesn't come, they'll act on their last order." Which was? Voss's eyes moved briefly to Molly. "Retrieve the document. Eliminate the risk." The fire crackled. Molly did not look away from the commander's face. She had already understood what she was, in this situation. She was the risk. She had been the risk since before she was born. Probably. The daughter of a woman who had kept a secret for 30 years. The granddaughter of a man who had written something down that someone powerful wished had never been written. "How much time?" Draven asked. "An hour. Less if the weather changes. Cold fronts affect scent carrying and they'll compensate by closing in." He nodded once. Then he looked at Molly. "Can you ride?" "Yes," she said. She had not ridden in 2 years, since selling her mother's horse to cover the cost of the last winter's supplies. But this was not the moment to qualify the answer. "There's a horse in my guard's camp. Steady animal, won't startle. Voss will take you to it." He began to rise from the cot, and this time she moved to help him automatically, getting her shoulder under his arm before he'd finished the motion. He accepted this without comment. We moved to Greyvale. It's 3 hours north at a controlled pace. There is a council lodge there that operates under neutral territory provisions. No single pack authority, no right of pursuit across the threshold. "And from Greyvale?" "From Greyvale," he said, settling his weight carefully onto both feet, testing the wound's tolerance with the measured attention of someone taking inventory. "We send the map." She looked at him. "Send it where?" "To the one council member Cassin has never been able to compromise." He took a slow breath and straightened fully. The wound held. She could see the effort it cost him and the absolute refusal to show it. "Elder Prentice of the Western Ridge. She is 81 years old. She has attended every council session for 50 years, and she has a memory like carved stone. If she receives a physical copy of the Vein Accord with both our attestations as witnesses to its authenticity, it becomes an official submission for reinstatement. Cassin cannot bury it a second time without the entire council seeing him do it. And that exposes him. Publicly, irrevocably." His voice was steady. "It also reopens the question of every action he took in the years since the record was sealed, including the Ashby fire, including the Croft raid." A pause. "Including your mother." Molly put on her cloak. She fastened it at the collar with the 2 bone buttons her mother had sewn there the winter before she died, because the original buttons had cracked in the cold, and her mother had said there was no sense in wearing a cloak that let the wind through. She pressed her fingers briefly against the pocket where the map sat. Then she took the small locked box of surgical tools from the cedar chest, because if Draven's wound needed attention during the ride, she would need them, and tucked it into the deep outer pocket of the cloak. She looked around the cottage once. The fire she banked rather than extinguished. A habit. her mother's habit, because an extinguished fire in a healer's cottage was a signal that the healer was gone and wouldn't be returning. And she did not want to give Cassan's people that certainty. The herbs she left, the books she left. Agnes. She had already, during the quiet of the standoff, released into the small enclosed garden at the cottage's rear, where the stone walls were high, and there was water from the rain barrel and dried grass enough for several days. The goat regarded her with magnificent indifference and turned away. Molly closed the garden gate carefully and told herself she would be back to open it again. She wasn't certain she believed it yet, but she said it anyway. The move through the perimeter was the most frightening thing she had ever done, while also being, paradoxically, almost entirely silent. Voss went first, then Molly, then Draven, and the Draven's guard wolves. She could feel them around her in the darkness without seeing most of them, a warmth and a presence that moved with the group like a surrounding tide, parted the way through Cassan's outer ring with a precision that spoke of rehearsal, of wolves who had trained for exactly this kind of extraction. No howls, no signals, just movement, quick and quiet through the frost-stiff undergrowth, the ashwood closing around them and then releasing them by degrees as they moved north. Molly rode behind Voss on the steady gray horse the commander had described, because Draven's injury made it impractical for him to manage a second rider and impractical for him to ride at speed without support. He rode to Molly's left on a dark horse that moved with the absolute quiet of long familiarity, and she noticed, with the part of her mind that was always recording, always cataloging, the part her mother had trained whether she'd meant to or not, that he checked her position every few minutes. Not watching over her shoulder, not hovering, just a steady periodic confirmation, the way you check the horizon for weather when you know the route but respect the road. It was so different from being watched with suspicion, or watched with assessment, or watched with the calculating look she had sometimes gotten from men in the village who were deciding whether she was useful to them, that it took her 3 confirmations before she identified what it actually was. He was making sure she was still there. Not because she was the map. Not because she was the witness. Just making sure. She looked away before he could catch her looking. An hour into the ride, the cold deepened, and the clouds that had been building all day finally released what they'd been holding. Not snow, freezing rain, small and stinging, the kind that coated everything it touched with a thin shell of ice and made the horse's footing uncertain. Voss slowed the pace. Draven moved his horse closer to Molly's without being asked, providing a windbreak on the northern side that reduced the sting of the rain considerably. She wanted to tell him she was fine. She kept her mouth closed, because she was cold, and the rain was miserable, and the windbreak was genuinely helpful. And there was a particular kind of pride that her mother had called cutting off your nose to spite your face, and her mother had always been right about most things. They stopped at a way station, a low stone building maintained under the same neutral territory provisions as the lodge at Greyvale, stocked with basic supplies for travelers and off-limits to pack authority by treaty. Voss checked the wound while Molly held the lamp and dictated what to look for and what to do. The stitches were holding. The heat around the wound had not worsened. The poultice needed refreshing, which Molly did with the supplies she had brought, working quickly in the low light while the rain hammered the stone roof overhead. Draven sat through all of it without complaint or instruction. When she finished and stepped back, he said, "Thank you." 2 words, simply delivered. But she had heard enough hollow courtesies in her life, the village council's polite dismissals, the distant gratitude she had described to herself earlier, to know the difference between a word that was filling space and a word that meant exactly what it said. "Don't tear the stitches," she said, because it was easier than acknowledging the word properly. "If you tear them at this stage, I cannot guarantee the same result a second time." "Understood," he said. Voss, from across the room where she was consulting a worn map of the northern route, made a sound that was almost certainly not a laugh, and definitely was. They rode the second half in easier silence, the rain easing to a mist as they descended from the ridge toward the valley where Greyvale sat. The lodge was visible from the high point of the road, lit windows, a central hall, the outline of a wall that was old and thick and built with intent. As they rode through the gate, a guard in neutral territory Gray stepped forward, and then stepped back when he saw Draven, not with the quick withdrawal of fear, but with the measured deference of recognition. Inside, the hall was warm and smelled of pine resin and tallow candles and something cooking that Molly's empty stomach registered with sudden and embarrassing urgency. She had not eaten since before she went out looking for Agnes that morning, which felt like it belonged to a different week entirely. Draven noticed. Of course he noticed. "Eat first," he said, when Voss began outlining the timeline for the message to Elder Prentice. "Both of you. The message can wait an hour." Voss looked like she might argue, assessed something in his expression, and didn't. Molly sat at the long wooden table in the lodge hall with a bowl of broth and bread that was 2 days old but warm from being held near the hearth, and she ate with the focused attention of someone who has been running on cold air and urgency for too many hours. Across the table, Draven ate as well, carefully, his injured side managed with the same controlled economy he brought to everything. At some point in the middle of the meal, he said, without preamble, "Your mother left you more than the document." She looked up. "The knowledge she gave you," he said, "the training, the records she kept." He held her gaze steadily. "She was preparing you. She simply couldn't tell you what for." Molly looked down at the bread in her hands. She thought about her mother at the long work table, patient and precise, teaching her the name of every herb twice, once for its use, once for its danger, teaching her to clean a wound before it looked infected rather than after, teaching her to read a person's breathing before their words, teaching her, always, to stay calm when the situation was not calm. Because calm was not the absence of fear, her mother had said. Calm was what fear looked like when it had somewhere useful to go. She had thought her mother was teaching her to be a healer. Her mother had been teaching her to survive this. "She should have told me," Molly said. Her voice was even, but the grief in it was audible, she knew. Not the raw grief of new loss, but the older, layered kind that has been lived with long enough to be part of the architecture of a person. "Yes," Draven said simply. He did not explain it away. He did not offer her a reason that would make it hurt less. He just agreed, and let the truth of it sit where it was. It was, she thought, a strange kind of comfort. More honest than comfort usually was. Outside, the mist had cleared. Through the lodge's high windows, she could see the sky beginning to darken toward evening, and at its edge, the first cold stars appearing one by one above the ridge they had crossed. Somewhere behind them, in a cottage at the center of an old boundary line, a banked fire was still burning. The message to Elder Prentice left Greyvale before midnight. Voss dispatched it herself, carried by 2 of the most trusted riders in Draven's guard. Not wolves in their shifted form, but men on horseback, because horses covered frozen roads faster and arrived looking like travelers rather than a declaration of intent. The message contained a written account of the ambush, a formal attestation signed by Draven as Alpha King, and countersigned by Molly as the surviving heir to the Vane Accord, and a precise physical description of the document itself, enough for Elder Prentice to verify authenticity before the original arrived. The original would travel separately, with a different escort, by a different route. Voss had explained this with the brisk efficiency of someone who had spent years thinking about how things went wrong and building the second and third option into every plan before the first one was even finished. Molly had listened carefully and asked 2 questions, both of which Voss had answered with what Molly was beginning to recognize as the commander's version of approval, a fractional pause before the answer, as though she was noting the quality of the question. That night, Molly was given a room on the lodge's upper floor. Small, stone-walled, with a narrow bed and a wool blanket that smelled of cedar, and a window that looked north toward the ridge. She sat on the edge of the bed for a long time without lying down, still wearing her cloak, the map folded against her ribs. She thought about the Ashby fire, the Croft raid, her mother's fever. She thought about Lord Casson of the Eastern Reach, whose name she had not known this morning, and who had apparently spent years quietly dismantling every thread that led back to an accord her grandfather had written in good faith. She tried to build a face for him from nothing and couldn't. He was still only a name, a shape behind the events that had taken her mother, a force that had been pressing against her family's life without her ever seeing it. She would see it soon enough. She slept eventually, and did not dream, which was its own kind of mercy. 3 days later, the reply came from Elder Prentice. It arrived as a sealed letter carried by a rider so exhausted that the lodge staff had to help him from the saddle, and it bore the elder's personal seal, a pressed image of the Western Ridge's distinctive silhouette in black wax, which Voss said was something the elder used only for communications she considered beyond dispute. The letter was addressed to Molly, not to Draven, not to Voss, not to the Alpha King or his guard or any formal title. To Molly Vane, healer of Ashford Hollow, heir to the Vane Accord. She broke the seal herself and read it at the long table in the lodge hall, with Draven to her left, and Voss standing at the room's edge and the fire burning well because someone had kept it well tended through the night. Elder Prentice's handwriting was old and fierce, the letters formed with a pressure that suggested a woman who had been making permanent marks on things for a very long time. The Vane Accord has been formally submitted for reinstatement before the full council. An emergency session has been called for 10 days hence at the Central Hall. Your presence is required as primary witness. Lord Casson of the Eastern Reach has been formally notified of the submission and is suspended from council vote, pending investigation of the sealed record and its circumstances. He will contest this. He will lose. Come to the Central Hall. Bring the document. Bring the Alpha King if he is willing. I have waited 6 years for someone to hand me this particular thread. I intend to pull it until the whole thing unravels. Molly read the letter twice. Then she set it on the table. She knew, she said. She's been waiting for this. Prentice has suspected Cassine for years, Draven said. She had no proof she could move on. The sealed record left no trail visible enough to bring before the full council without appearing like a political attack. He looked at the letter. You gave her the trail. My grandfather gave her the trail, Molly said. 40 years ago. My mother kept it alive. I just carried it the last few miles. That last stretch is the one that mattered, Voss said from across the room plainly. Molly folded the letter along its original creases and held it in both hands, and thought about her mother moving a document 3 times in 10 years, telling no one, carrying the weight of it alone through 30 winters in a cottage at the center of a boundary line that wasn't supposed to exist anymore. She thought about how tired that must have been, how lonely, how her mother had still gotten up every morning and tended the herbs, and treated whoever came to the door, and taught Molly everything she knew with the patience of someone building something that needed to outlast them. She did not cry, but it was a near thing. The 10 days to the council session were not idle. Voss coordinated the formal guard escort to the Central Hall, a 3-day ride to the southeast across territory that was technically neutral, but had been Casson's practical sphere of influence for years. She did it with the methodical thoroughness that Molly had come to recognize as her baseline. Every contingency addressed, every route scouted, every member of the escort personally verified. Draven spent the days in controlled activity, his wound healing with a speed that was not quite natural, and that Molly had stopped trying to explain in ordinary terms. She checked it each morning and evening, a routine that had developed without either of them formally establishing it, and he was there each time, seated at the room's work table, or by the window, or occasionally standing at the door looking out at the ridge, and he would turn when she came in, and she would assess the wound, and they would talk, briefly, about what was happening and what was coming. Those conversations expanded gradually, not toward the personal, not quite, not yet, but toward the honest. He told her what he knew of Casson's methods, what the investigation would likely surface, what reinstatement of the Accord would mean practically for the 3 territories it crossed. She told him what she remembered of her mother's habits around the locked chest, the patterns she'd noticed without understanding. The 2 times she'd seen her mother's composure crack in ways that made more sense now than they had then. He listened the way he did everything. Completely. Without performing attention. Without interrupting. When he spoke, it was because he had something to add. "She was not wrong to protect you by keeping you separate from it," he said once, in the middle of a conversation about her mother's choices. It was not a defense of the silence that had left Molly unprepared. It was simply a statement of the truth, as it existed alongside the other truth, which was that the silence had also cost something. He seemed to understand that both things could be real at once, without one canceling the other. She was beginning to think this was unusual. She was beginning to think she had not previously understood how unusual it was. The central hall was larger than anything Molly had seen in her life. A vast stone building at the geographic center of the 11 territories. Old enough that its walls had been repaired so many times the seams were part of its character. Its ceilings high and hung with the territorial banners of all 11 packs in colors that had faded to something richer than their original brightness. Elder Prentice was exactly what the letter had suggested. Small, ancient, with white hair pinned severely back and eyes that missed nothing and forgave very little. She greeted Molly with a handshake that was firmer than expected and said, looking directly into her eyes, "You look like your grandmother. She was the steadiest person in any room she entered. Try to be that today." Molly squared her shoulders. "Yes, Elder." Prentice held her gaze for a moment longer. Then she nodded once, as though something had been confirmed, and turned to lead them into the hall. Lord Cassine was already there. Molly had built no face for him across the 10 days of waiting, and the one she found was both more ordinary and more chilling than anything she had imagined. He was a man of late middle age, well-dressed, composed, with the particular careful stillness of someone who has spent years practicing how not to show what they are thinking. His eyes moved to Molly when she entered and stayed there for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to assess, not long enough to acknowledge, and then moved away. She understood in those 2 seconds that he had underestimated her mother for 30 years and was now recalculating whether he had made the same mistake with the daughter. He had. The session lasted 4 hours. Molly spoke twice. Once to attest to the map's provenance and the circumstances of its preservation. Once to formally confirm that the document had remained in her family's unbroken custody since her grandfather's hand had written it. She spoke clearly and without embellishment, because her mother had taught her that the truth, stated plainly, was more convincing than any ornamentation. Draven spoke once, to place the ambush in the Ashwood on record as a coordinated attack carried out by wolves aligned with Cassin's territory, with supporting attestation from Voss and 3 members of his guard who had identified the attacking wolves by pack scent. Elder Prentice spoke last. She spoke for 11 minutes. By the end of it, the chamber was absolutely silent. Cassin was stripped of his council seat before the afternoon was over. A formal investigation into the Ashby fire and the Croft raid was opened, with Prentice herself appointed as lead authority. The Vane Accord was reinstated in full, its protections reactivated across all 3 territories it crossed, and the neutral healer designations were restored, including Molly's cottage in Ashford Hollow, which was formally recognized as a protected point on the boundary line. Her mother's name was entered into the council record as a keeper of the Accord. Edmund Vane's original contribution was acknowledged in full. Molly sat with that for a long moment in the near-empty hall, after most of the council had filed out. The territorial banners moved slightly in the draft from the high windows. The candles on the long table had burned low. Someone had removed Cassin's chair from the council arc, and the gap it left was clean and deliberate and final. Voss was outside coordinating the return escort. Prentice had departed with the composure of a woman who had accomplished what she intended, and saw no reason to perform satisfaction about it. Draven sat beside Molly at the long table, not across from her, beside. He did not speak immediately. She was grateful for that. She needed another moment with it, with the weight of what had been set right, and with the weight of what could not be undone, which sat alongside the other weight, and did not dissolve just because justice had been spoken aloud in a stone hall. Her mother was still gone. The Ashby and Croft families had still lost what they'd lost. 30 years of silence and careful, lonely vigilance had still happened. But it had not been for nothing. It had never been for nothing. It had been for this. For a record reinstated. For names acknowledged. For a trail that could now be followed all the way to its source. She would have wanted to be here, Molly said finally. Her voice was quiet and steady. She was, Draven said, simply. In every word you said in there. Molly looked at the gap where Cassian's chair had been. She thought about Agnes waiting behind the garden wall. She thought about the banked fire she had left in a cottage at the center of a boundary line that now existed again on official record. She thought about going home. And then she thought about what home was now. Not a place she had stumbled through half-blind, unknowing, but a designated point on an accord that her grandfather had written and her mother had protected, and she had carried the last few miles when it mattered most. A place with a name in the record. A place with a purpose she now understood. She stood. She gathered her cloak. She checked instinctively that the map was still in her inner pocket, though it would soon be archived with the council record. Its work done. I need to go back, she said. There's a goat that's been alone in a garden for nearly 2 weeks, and she has an extremely poor opinion of me already. Draven rose beside her. There was something in his expression, the same something that had almost become a smile on the first morning, in her cottage, before everything broke open. This time, it arrived. Brief, quiet, but entirely real. My people will ride with you to the border, he said. And after the border, he looked at her with the directness that she had come to understand was simply how he looked at things he considered important. The Vane Accord guarantees regular contact between the Alpha Kings Council and the healer families at each designated point, quarterly, at minimum. A pause. I intend to honor that provision personally. Molly held his gaze. She thought about trust, which she had learned was not a door you opened all at once, but a threshold you crossed in steps, one at a time, when the ground beneath each step had proven solid enough to hold. The ground, she thought, was beginning to hold. Then I'll expect you in 3 months, she said. Knock before you enter, and come without an ambush if at all possible. I'll do my best, he said. They walked out of the central hall together, into an afternoon that was cold and clear. The sky above the 11 territories wide and pale, and lit from the west, with the last of the day's light. Voss was waiting with the horses. The guard was assembled, quiet and ready. The road south stretched out toward the ridge, and beyond it, the ashwood, and beyond that, a cottage with a banked fire and a garden wall, and a goat with strong opinions. Molly mounted without assistance, settled her cloak, and looked once more at the central hall behind her. At the old stone, the repaired seams, the high windows catching the last light. Then she turned south and rode toward home. The investigation into Cassian's actions concluded 4 months later. He was found responsible for ordering the destruction of the Ashby family's document, the raid on the Croft household, and the poisoning of Sarah Vane, Molly's mother, in the 3rd winter of his sealed record protection scheme. He was stripped of his territorial authority and exiled beyond the 11 pack borders, his lands redistributed under council oversight to the packs whose rights he had suppressed. The Ashby and Croft families received formal council acknowledgement of the wrongs done to them. It was not enough. It was also not nothing. Elder Prentice retired at the end of that year, at 82, having outlasted every person who had ever thought she could be managed. She left behind 50 years of council records in handwriting that would take archivists decades to fully catalog. Voss was appointed commander of the Interterritorial Guard, a position created specifically to address the gaps in neutral territory protection that Cassin's scheme had exploited. She accepted it with the same brisk efficiency with which she accepted everything, and immediately began building a 2nd and 3rd contingency into every protocol. Molly went home. She rebuilt the fire, retrieved Agnes from the garden, who expressed her displeasure at length and then forgave her by morning as goats do, restocked her herb shelves, and returned to the work her mother had trained her for. The cottage was formally recognized now, its designation restored, and healers from 2 neighboring territories sent word that they were glad of the neutral point on the old line. 3 months after the central hall, a rider arrived from the north with a letter bearing a personal seal she recognized. Draven arrived the following week. He knocked before entering. He came without an ambush. He came back after that, and the visits lengthened by degrees the way trust does. Not all at once, but steadily, each return confirming what the last had suggested, until the pattern was no longer a question, but a fact, solid and established, like a healed wound that has closed cleanly over. In the spring of the following year, in the cottage at the center of the old boundary line, with Agnes observing from the garden with her characteristic mixture of disdain and curiosity, Molly Vane and Draven of the Northern Pack signed a formal alliance document before Elder Prentice's chosen successor, not because they were required to, but because they chose to, which was the only reason either of them would have accepted. It was witnessed by Voss, who made no sound that could be definitively identified as emotional, and by 2 members of the guard who definitely did. The Vane Accord, reinstated and intact, listed Molly's cottage as a protected point on the boundary line in perpetuity. Her mother's name remained in the council record. Her grandfather's accord remained in the archive. And the fire in the hearth, banked carefully against the cold, burned through the night and into the morning, as it always had. Tended now by 2 pairs of hands instead of 1.